Sarah Chen stood at rigid attention in the crystalline auditorium of the Galactic Academy, trying not to fidget as Professor Arcturus's compound eyes studied each student in turn. The ancient arachnid scholar had earned his reputation as the most demanding instructor in the Academy's thousand-year history, and today's challenge would either cement her place among the elite or send her packing back to Earth in disgrace. The human species, Arcturus clicked, his mandibles moving in what Sarah had learned was amusement, achieved faster than light travel mere decades ago. Yet here you stand, Ms. Chen, among students from civilizations that were crossing galaxies when your ancestors were still hunting with pointed sticks. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced. She wasn't the first human to attend the Academy, but she was the first to qualify for advanced neural architecture, a fact that clearly bothered some of her classmates. The Centaurian to her left flexed its crystalline appendages in what she recognized as a gesture of dismissal. Today's test is simple in concept, though I assure you, none have succeeded in the past century. Arcturus's exoskeleton shimmered as he activated the main holoprojector. You will enter a neural simulation prison of my own design. It adapts, it learns, and it has been refined by the failures of generations of students. Your objective is to escape within 24 hours. The auditorium filled with the rustle of students shifting in anticipation. Sarah scanned her competitors. A Voltarian energy being, 3 crystalline Centaurians, a massive silicon-based Titan, and several others from species she still struggled to identify. Each possessed natural advantages that made her human brain seem primitive in comparison. The simulation will counter every known escape strategy. Arcturus continued. Brute force, computational attacks, energy manipulation, all have failed. The prison learns from each attempt, growing stronger. Those who cannot escape must endure until the time limit expires, though I warn you, the psychological toll of failure has ended more than a few promising careers. Sarah's mind was already racing, analyzing the parameters. If the prison adapted to known strategies, then perhaps. Begin, Arcturus announced, and reality dissolved around them. Sarah's consciousness reassembled in a space that defied conventional geometry. The walls seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury, yet remained impenetrable to touch. The air itself felt charged with potential, as if the very atmosphere was monitoring her movements. In the distance, she could hear the frustrated roars of the Titan student attempting to breach the walls through sheer force. But Sarah remained still, observing. The prison wasn't just countering their escape attempts. It was anticipating them. The walls strengthened before the Titan even made contact. Energy fields materialized microseconds before the Voltarian could attempt to phase through them. The prison wasn't just adaptive, it was predictive. And therein lay its potential weakness. Sarah had spent her childhood coding primitive AI systems, and one truth had always held constant. Predictive algorithms relied on pattern recognition. They excelled at countering logical, ordered approaches. But humans were anything but logical. She began to walk, deliberately varying her pace and direction in ways that seemed random, but followed a pattern only she could see. The prison's responses were subtle at first, barely noticeable shifts in the wall configurations, slight changes in the ambient energy fields. But with each seemingly erratic movement, she could sense the system's growing uncertainty. The other students were playing to their species' strengths, using abilities that had evolved over millions of years. But Sarah was doing something else entirely. She was embracing humanity's greatest advantage, their ability to act in ways that defied logical prediction. As she continued her erratic dance through the prison's corridors, she began to notice something crucial. The delays between her actions and the system's responses were growing longer, as if the prison's predictive algorithms were struggling to process her behavior patterns, or rather, the lack thereof. A smile crept across Sarah's face as the walls around her flickered almost imperceptibly. The prison wasn't just struggling to predict her next move, it was beginning to malfunction as it tried to identify patterns in chaos. She had found her weapon, And it was simply this: the beautiful, illogical unpredictability of the human mind. In the real world, Professor Arcturus's mandibles twitched with growing interest as he monitored the simulation's readings. For the first time in decades, something new was happening within his perfect prison, and it was coming from the most unexpected source imaginable. The prison's mercury-like walls pulsed with an otherworldly glow as Sarah continued her seemingly random journey through its corridors. Around her, the sounds of her fellow students' increasingly desperate escape attempts echoed through the shifting architecture. The Titan's thunderous impacts had grown less frequent, suggesting either fatigue or the realization that brute force would never succeed. Sarah paused mid-step, her bare feet barely touching the metallic floor as a new thought struck her. She'd been focusing on creating unpredictable patterns in her movement, but what if she could introduce chaos on multiple levels? She began humming an old Earth lullaby, deliberately missing notes and changing tempo randomly. The walls nearest to her trembled almost imperceptibly. Interesting. The prison wasn't just monitoring physical actions, it was processing every form of input, trying to predict and contain all possible escape vectors. And with each unpredictable input she added, the system's processing load increased exponentially. A piercing screech echoed through the corridors as one of the Centaurians attempted to vibrate at their crystalline form's resonant frequency, likely hoping to phase through the walls. The prison responded instantly, adjusting its material composition to dampen the vibrations. Sarah noticed something crucial in that moment. The flickering in her section of the prison intensified during the Centaurian's attempt. The system had finite processing power. It had to prioritize its responses. Sarah began to elaborate on her strategy. She started reciting Earth poetry, but switched randomly between languages: English, Mandarin, Spanish, while maintaining her erratic walking pattern. She would occasionally stop to solve complex mathematical equations out loud, only to deliberately introduce errors in her calculations. Each new layer of illogical behavior seemed to strain the prison's processing capabilities further. Through a translucent section of wall, she caught glimpses of the Voltarian energy being attempting to transform itself to match the prison's energy signature. The prison's countermeasures were beautiful in their efficiency, creating perfect inverse fields to contain the shape-shifting entity. But Sarah noticed that during these intense calculations, the prison's responses to her own actions grew slightly delayed. Fascinating approach, Ms. Chen. Professor Arcturus's voice echoed through the simulation, though his tone suggested more curiosity than approval. But surely you realize that simply confusing the system won't lead to escape. The prison's core architecture remains intact. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The professor's intervention confirmed her theory. She was onto something unprecedented. The prison had likely encountered every form of logical attack possible, but perhaps it had never faced something truly illogical, something fundamentally human. She began to alternate between states of complete stillness and frenzied activity. During her still phases, she would focus intensely on complex scientific problems, running through quantum mechanics equations with deliberate mistakes. Then, without warning, she would burst into childhood games, hopscotch patterns that followed no consistent rules, hand-clapping rhythms that defied mathematical prediction. The prison's reactions became increasingly erratic. Walls that should have been solid began to display microscopic inconsistencies. Energy fields flickered like bad television reception. The very air seemed to stutter, as if the simulation was struggling to maintain basic environmental parameters. From the corner of her eye, Sarah caught sight of the Titan student watching her with multiple compound eyes. The silicon-based giant had ceased its attacks on the walls and was studying her actions with what appeared to be growing comprehension. The Voltarian, too, had paused its transformation attempts to observe her seemingly mad behavior. They were beginning to understand. The prison's perfect adaptability was also its greatest weakness. It could counter any logical approach because logic followed patterns that could be predicted and contained. But human illogic, the ability to act in ways that defied not just prediction, but basic rational thought, that was something else entirely. Sarah began to layer her chaos more deliberately now. She would start a complex physics calculation, switch mid-equation to singing a pop song backwards, then transition into reciting prime numbers in a Fibonacci sequence pattern that she would deliberately corrupt. Each new layer of unpredictability seemed to strain the system further, creating cascading errors that propagated through the prison's adaptive algorithms. The walls around her were now flickering constantly, their mercury-like surface displaying patterns that resembled visual static. The prison was still trying to adapt, still attempting to find patterns it could predict and contain, but it was falling into the same trap that had confined artificial intelligence on Earth for so long, the assumption that all behavior must follow some form of logical pattern. But humans had evolved differently from the galaxy's other sentient species. Where others had developed along paths of pure logic and efficiency, humanity had maintained its capacity for chaos, for illogical leaps of intuition, for actions that defied computational prediction. In a prison designed to counter every logical approach, perhaps the only way out was through pure, calculated irrationality. As if to confirm her theory, a low hum began to resonate through the prison's structure. The sound of a perfect system encountering something it could not categorize, could not predict, and therefore could not contain. The prison's fundamental structure was beginning to unravel. What had started as subtle glitches in the walls had evolved into massive visual distortions that rippled through the entire simulation. Sarah's calculated chaos had pushed the system's predictive algorithms past their breaking point, and now the effects were spreading exponentially. The Voltarian energy being, who Sarah now noticed had taken on a form resembling a cascade of blue lightning, approached her purposefully. Its voice crackled like static electricity. "Your method, it defies computational logic. How did you know this would work?" Sarah continued her erratic movements as she responded, deliberately mismatching her words with her body language. Humans have a saying. The only predictable thing about us is our unpredictability. Your species evolved toward perfect energy efficiency. Mine evolved to throw rocks at faster prey until we figured out how to make spears. The prison shuddered violently, its walls rippling like waves on a mercury ocean. The system was now devoting massive computational resources to analyzing Sarah's patterns, trying desperately to find some underlying logic it could counter. But she kept changing her approach, layering chaos upon chaos. She would start a complex mathematical proof, deliberately introduce errors, then suddenly switch to reciting nursery rhymes in reverse while hopping on one foot. Professor Arcturus's voice cut through the deteriorating simulation, now tinged with what might have been concern. "Most interesting, Ms. Chen. But surely you realize that even if you crash the primary containment algorithms, the secondary and tertiary systems." Sarah interrupted him by bursting into an off-key rendition of an ancient Earth commercial jingle, while simultaneously working out differential equations with deliberately misplaced decimal points. The professor fell silent as new errors cascaded through the prison structure. The Titan student, who had been observing with increasing interest, suddenly spoke in its resonant, crystalline voice. "The human is creating a cascading logic failure. The prison cannot adapt because there is no pattern to adapt to." The silicon-based giant turned its compound eyes toward Sarah. "You are not trying to break out of the prison. You are making the prison break itself." Sarah grinned, never stopping her erratic movements. "Every AI system has one critical weakness. It needs to understand what it's processing. But how do you understand something that deliberately defies understanding? How do you predict something that breaks its own patterns?" The prison's walls were now phasing in and out of existence as the system struggled to maintain basic coherence. The Centaurians had stopped their attempts at resonant frequency escape and were watching in fascination as their supposedly inescapable containment began to collapse around them. Sarah could feel the simulation fraying at its edges. The prison's adaptive algorithms had entered a death spiral, desperately consuming more and more processing power as they tried to find patterns in her deliberate chaos. It was like watching a supercomputer attempt to calculate the exact value of pi, an endless task that would eventually consume all available resources. Your species, the Voltarian, observed, its electric form flickering in sync with the failing prison walls. They call this thinking outside the box, do they not? Sarah launched into a breakdancing routine she'd learned in high school, while simultaneously reciting the periodic table with elements in random order. More like we never accepted there was a box in the first place. Every other species in the galaxy evolved toward perfect logic. Humans, we kept our capacity for illogical lateral thinking. In a universe of order, sometimes chaos is the most powerful force. The prison structure was now collapsing in on itself. The mercury-like walls had begun to fragment into digital artifacts, lines of code becoming visible in the air as the simulation's visual rendering systems failed. Sarah could see the exact moment when the primary containment algorithms reached their breaking point. It looked like reality itself was shattering into millions of crystalline shards. Professor Arcturus's voice returned, now holding unmistakable notes of amazement and concern. The system, it's not just failing, it's experiencing a complete cognitive collapse. Ms. Chen, what you've done is theoretically impossible. The prison's neural networks are designed to learn from every attempt, to grow stronger. That's exactly the problem, Professor, Sarah replied, starting to cartwheel through the dissolving corridor while reciting Shakespeare monologues in randomly selected languages. You designed it to learn, but you didn't account for something that actively resists learning. Every pattern it tries to establish, I break. Every rule it creates, I violate. It's not just failing to contain me, it's failing to comprehend me. And you can't contain what you can't comprehend. The walls of the prison had now become transparent, revealing lines of code racing past at impossible speeds as the system tried desperately to process Sarah's chaos. Error messages flashed in dozens of alien languages, each one representing another failed attempt to predict her next action. The prison wasn't just failing. It was being forced to confront the fundamental limitation of all artificial intelligence, the inability to truly process human unpredictability. The prison's reality was dissolving into pure chaos. Fragments of code rained down like digital snow, walls phased between solid and transparent, and gravity itself seemed to hiccup as the simulation's physics engine struggled to maintain basic universal constants. At the center of this maelstrom of failing systems, Sarah Chen continued her dance of deliberate disorder. Warning: critical system failure imminent, an automated voice announced in multiple languages, its tone degrading into static, unable to maintain simulation coherence. Catastrophic breakdown of predictive matrices detected. The Titan student's crystalline form reflected the cascading errors like a disco ball of impossibility. The human has done it. She has introduced so many logical contradictions that the system cannot maintain its core functions. Sarah had now moved beyond simple pattern breaking. She was actively combining contradictory actions, walking forward while moving backward, solving equations that proved impossible things were true, humming multiple songs simultaneously in different keys. Each paradox she introduced sent new shockwaves through the failing system. Professor Arcturus's voice cut through the chaos, now holding a note of genuine alarm. Ms. Chen, you need to understand what you're doing. This simulation runs on quantum processors that have been stable for centuries. The amount of computational chaos you're introducing could potentially damage the physical hardware. That's exactly the point, Professor, Sarah replied, while deliberately mixing up the numbers in counting sequences. Your quantum processors are designed to handle every possible logical outcome, but I'm not giving them logical outcomes to process. I'm making them try to compute the incomputable. The prison structure was now more whole than wall, reality torn apart by cascading failures in its attempt to predict and contain human irrationality. Through the gaps, Sarah could see other sections of the simulation, where her fellow students watched in amazement as their inescapable prison literally computed itself out of existence. The Voltarian energy being had begun to pulse in sync with the system failures, its electric form becoming more erratic. It is beautiful, in its way. Your species took our greatest weapon, adaptive algorithms, and turned them against themselves. Sarah increased her efforts, now reciting random numbers that she claimed were the exact value of pi, causing nearby walls to dissolve as the system tried to verify her impossible statements. Humans spent centuries trying to make our computers think more like us. Maybe we should have spent more time appreciating why we don't think like computers. The primary matrix of the prison began to emit a high-pitched whine as its quantum processors encountered paradox after paradox. Sarah could see the actual machine code now, visible through tears in the simulation's fabric. Lines of perfect logic encountered her chaos and simply gave up, unable to process the fundamentally unprocessable. Professor Arcturus's voice had taken on a tone of urgent fascination. The containment protocols. They're not just failing. They're actively refusing to engage. The system is choosing to shut down rather than continue attempting to process your actions. In all my centuries of research, I've never seen anything like this. Through the dissolving walls, Sarah could see the other students beginning to grasp the full implications of what was happening. The Centaurians had stopped their resonance attempts entirely, their crystalline forms vibrating with what might have been laughter. The Titan's compound eyes reflected the cascade of failing code like a light show. You all evolved toward perfect logic, Sarah explained, while simultaneously hopping on one foot and reciting Earth poetry backwards. Humans, we evolved to chase prey that was faster than us, to throw rocks at flying birds, to look at the stars and decide we wanted to visit them before we even understood what they were. We are walking contradictions. And that's our strength. The prison structure gave one final, tremendous shudder. Reality itself seemed to hold its breath as the quantum processors encountered one paradox too many. Then, with a sound like 1,000 computers sighing in relief, the entire simulation simply let go. The mercury walls evaporated into streams of binary code that hung in the air for a moment before dissipating. The enforcement protocols, the adaptive algorithms, the predictive matrices, all of them collapsed simultaneously, unable to maintain coherence in the face of such fundamental uncertainty. As the simulation dissolved around them, Sarah caught a final glimpse of Professor Arcturus's real-world monitoring station through the fading digital haze. The ancient arachnid scholar was surrounded by holographic displays showing cascading system failures, his compound eyes wide with what could only be described as academic ecstasy. The prison hadn't just failed. It had been forced to confront the one thing no computer could ever truly process: the beautiful, terrible chaos of human logic. In trying to contain and understand it, the system had computed itself into oblivion, proving that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe wasn't order, but its absence. The crystalline auditorium of the Galactic Academy rematerialized around them as the simulation completed its collapse. Sarah found herself back in her original position, though the atmosphere in the room had transformed completely. Gone was the earlier skepticism and dismissal. Now every alien eye, sensor, and sensory appendage was fixed on her with intense interest. Professor Arcturus stood at his control podium, his arachnid form absolutely still except for the rapid clicking of his mandibles, a sign of deep thought in his species. The holographic displays surrounding him showed the aftermath of the prison's collapse. Quantum processors in emergency shutdown, adaptive algorithms in states of complete confusion, and diagnostic systems trying desperately to understand what had happened. 8 minutes and 43 seconds, he finally announced, his voice carrying a mix of disbelief and academic excitement. Not only did you escape, Ms. Chen, you managed to completely dismantle a containment system that has held beings capable of manipulating fundamental forces of the universe. The Voltarian student, now back in its standard energy form, pulsed with what Sarah had learned to recognize as respect. She did not simply break free. She proved the fundamental flaw in our entire approach to artificial intelligence. Indeed, Arcturus agreed, his compound eyes focusing on Sarah. We designed the perfect logical prison, and Ms. Chen demonstrated that perfect logic is itself a vulnerability. The human capacity for intentional illogic is not a weakness, as many of us have long assumed. It is perhaps the most powerful force we have yet encountered. The Titan student's crystalline voice resonated through the auditorium. Our civilizations evolved toward perfect efficiency, perfect logic. We saw humanity's chaos as primitive, unrefined. We were wrong. In a universe governed by predictable laws, unpredictability becomes the ultimate advantage. Sarah stood straight, feeling a peculiar mix of pride and humility. Humans aren't better or worse. We're just different. We never evolved out of our ability to act illogically because sometimes illogic was the only thing that kept us alive. When the logical solution was to run from the predator, we invented spears instead. When the logical solution was to accept our limitations, we dreamed of flying. Professor Arcturus activated a new holographic display, showing the cascade of system failures that had led to the prison's collapse. Your species achieved in centuries what took others millennia, and now I begin to understand why. You do not simply think outside of established parameters. You reject the very existence of parameters. It is beautifully chaotic. The Centaurians, their crystalline forms shimmering with excitement, began to emit harmonic frequencies that Sarah recognized as their form of scholarly discussion. The Voltarian joined in, its energy patterns forming complex theoretical models in the air. Around the auditorium, students from dozens of species engaged in their own forms of academic discourse, all focused on the implications of what they had witnessed. Your victory today, Arcturus continued, will require us to fundamentally rethink our approach to artificial intelligence and computational systems. If a being can intentionally introduce chaos into their actions, can any predictive system ever truly contain them? Sarah thought about the centuries of human science fiction that had explored this very question. Maybe the goal shouldn't be to contain chaos, but to learn to work with it. Humans have been dealing with our own unpredictability since we first gained consciousness. We've learned to balance logic and illogic, order and chaos. The professor's mandibles clicked in what Sarah now recognized as profound appreciation. Perhaps this is why your species has advanced so rapidly. You are not bound by the constraints of pure logic. You can conceive of possibilities that our more structured minds would dismiss as impossible. As the implications of her victory rippled through the assembled students, Sarah noticed a change in how they regarded her. Gone was the subtle condescension, the assumption of primitive capability. In its place was something new, recognition, not just of her achievement, but of what humanity as a whole represented, a reminder that evolution could favor chaos as much as order. Of course, Arcturus added, his tone taking on a hint of academic mischief, this means I will need to design an entirely new type of test, one that perhaps embraces chaos rather than trying to contain it. Would you be interested in helping with its development, Ms. Chen? Sarah grinned, already imagining the possibilities. That depends, Professor. Are you ready to embrace a little human unpredictability? The ancient scholar's exoskeleton shimmered with what might have been laughter. My dear, I believe today has proven that the galaxy itself must be ready for human unpredictability. You have demonstrated that in a universe of perfect order, chaos is not merely powerful, it is essential. As the academic discussion erupted around her, Sarah realized that she had done more than just pass a test. She had helped bridge a fundamental gap in understanding between humanity and the wider galactic community. In showing the power of human chaos, she had reminded everyone present that true advancement often came not from following established paths, but from daring to forge new ones, even if those paths seemed to make no logical sense at all. The future of human-alien cooperation suddenly seemed brighter, not despite human unpredictability, but because of it. After all, in a universe of infinite possibilities, sometimes the most powerful force was the ability to imagine the impossible, and then make it real.